I started working at Colville and Burke Property Management in March, not because I wanted to, but because my wife had been dead for 4 months, and I'd stopped paying the mortgage. The firm handled residential placements across the northeast side of the city. Nothing glamorous, mostly low-income housing, subsidized units, Section 8 approvals. My job title was tenant coordinator, which meant I processed applications, verified employment and income documents, ran background checks through a third-party vendor called ClearTenant, and matched approved applicants to available units in the company's portfolio. I was good at it. The work was repetitive and administrative, and after Laura died, that was exactly what I needed. A reason to sit at a desk, a screen to look at, people to speak to on the phone without any of them knowing my kitchen smelled like mold because I hadn't opened the window since December. My supervisor was a woman named Diane Obach. She'd been with the firm for 11 years and had a way of explaining things that made you feel like every policy existed for an extremely boring reason, which I found comforting. She showed me the intake system on my second day. We used a proprietary database called unsettling. It looked like it had been designed in 2004, and it probably had. Every unit in the company's portfolio was listed with its status. Green meant vacant, yellow meant pending, red meant occupied. When I processed a new placement, I'd change the status from green to yellow, upload the signed lease, then shift it to red once the tenant confirmed move-in. Diane told me most coordinators handle between 40 and 60 active units. She assigned me a starting load of 53. I want to be clear about something. I was careful. Before everything happened, and during, and after. I was careful because the job required it, and because being careful was the only thing I had left that resembled a personality. I double-checked every application. I called landlords. I verified social security numbers against a federal lookup tool. When I entered a new tenant into HousingLink, I made sure the name matched the lease matched the unit number, and the unit number matched the physical address in our records. I say this because when I eventually brought the problem to Diane, her first instinct was to suggest I'd made a data entry error. I hadn't. It started in late April with a unit on Delancey Street, 4412 Delancey, Unit 7B. I'd processed the placement myself 3 weeks earlier. A woman named Rosa Molina, 34, single, employed part-time at a laundry service on Greer Avenue. Her paperwork was clean, the lease was standard 12-month. I'd switched the unit to red on April 3rd after she confirmed move-in by phone. On April 22nd, I got an intake request for a new applicant to be placed in the same unit. 4412 Delancey, 7B. The system showed it as green, vacant. I assumed it was a glitch. HousingLink was old software, and sometimes status changes didn't save properly if the server hiccuped. I pulled up the unit history and found Rosa Molina's lease still attached, but the status had reverted to green with no explanation. There was no move-out record, no early termination, no note from the landlord. I called Rosa's number. It rang 5 times and went to a generic voicemail. I called the building's property manager, a man named Gil Tavares, and asked about 7B. He said the unit was empty, had been empty for a while. I told him I'd placed someone there 3 weeks ago, a woman named Rosa Molina. He said he didn't know anyone by that name. I asked him maybe she'd moved out without notifying us. He said no one had moved in or out of 7B since January. I thanked him and hung up. Then I checked my records. The lease was still in the system. Rosa Molina's application, her income verification, her ClearTenant background report. All still there, all time-stamped, all bearing my digital signature as the processing coordinator. But the unit was empty. Gil Tavares had no record of her. And when I searched Rosa Molina's name in every database I had access to, HousingLink, ClearTenant, even a basic Google search, I found nothing outside of what I had entered myself. I want to be honest about how I felt in that moment. Not scared, annoyed. I thought someone had used a fake identity to secure a lease, ghosted on the unit, and now I'd have to file a fraud report that would eat up my afternoon. It happens sometimes. Diane had warned me during training. People fabricated documents, used stolen social security numbers, disappeared after getting approved. It was a known problem in subsidized housing. So I flagged the file, wrote up a brief report, and moved on. The second time was May 9th, a unit at 2200 Harker Road, Unit 14. I'd processed this one on April 18th. The tenant was a man named Dennis Vong, 41, recently employed at a tire warehouse. Standard 12-month lease. I'd confirmed move-in on April 20th. On May 9th, the unit showed green, vacant, no move-out record, no termination. Dennis Vong's lease and application was still in the system, still bearing my digital signature, but when I called the building manager, she told me 14 had been empty since February. This time I drove to the building. It was a 12-unit walk-up near the old rail corridor, the kind of place with buzzer panels that hadn't worked since the Clinton administration. I went to the 14th unit on the 3rd floor. The door was unlocked. Inside the unit was empty. Not abandoned. Empty. Clean empty. The floors had been swept. The kitchen counter had been wiped. There was a faint smell of something chemical, like industrial cleaner, but nothing else. No furniture, no boxes, no indication anyone had ever been there. I stood in the doorway for a while. Then I checked the mailbox downstairs. The label on box 14 was blank. I drove back to the office and pulled Dennis Vong's file. His application listed an employer, Grant and Tire and Service on 118th. I called the number. A woman answered. I asked to speak with Dennis Vong or confirm his employment. She said she'd never heard of him. I asked if she was sure. She said Grant and Tire had 6 employees and she was the owner's wife and she knew all of them by name. There was no Dennis Vong. That night I sat in my car in the office parking lot for 40 minutes. I wasn't processing what was happening in any useful way. I was just sitting with the fact that I'd placed 2 tenants into 2 different units across the city, confirmed their move-ins, filed their paperwork, and both of them had disappeared without a trace. Not just from their apartments, but from the records of the people and businesses that were supposed to know them. The leases I'd signed were still in the system. My name was still on them, but the people attached to those leases seemed to not exist. I brought it to Diane the next morning. I showed her both files. I showed her the green status on both units. I showed her the timestamps on my processing work and the current vacancy records. She listened carefully, scrolled through the files on her own screen, then asked if I was sure I hadn't accidentally duplicated a test entry. I told her I was sure. She asked if I'd been sleeping well. I told her I'd been sleeping fine, which was a lie, but not a relevant one. She said she'd flag it for the IT team and asked me to keep processing my other units in the meantime. I want to describe what the next 2 weeks felt like, because I think it matters. I kept working. I processed new applications. I ran background checks. I confirmed move-ins. And every morning I logged into Housing Link and checked my active units. And every morning they were all red, occupied, accounted for. Everything was normal. I started to believe the Rosa Molina and Dennis Vong situations had been some kind of elaborate fraud. Maybe a ring operating across multiple buildings, using fake identities to secure units for short-term use and then vanishing. It was the most rational explanation. And I needed rational explanations the way other people needed coffee. Then on May 26th, I found a third one. 809 Carvel Lane, Unit 3A. The tenant's name was Margaret Beach, 67, retired. Income from Social Security. I'd processed her on May 1st and confirmed move-in on May 4th. On the 26th, the unit was green. Margaret Beach's lease was in the system. Her application was in the system. My signature was on everything. The building superintendent told me 3A had been empty for months. He'd never heard of Margaret Beach. I did something different this time. Instead of calling the phone number on her application, I drove to the address she'd listed as her previous residence. A house on Oleander Street, South Side, near the old brewery. It was a real house. The lawn was mowed. There was a car in the driveway. I knocked on the door and a man in his 50s answered. I told him I was from Colville and Burke and I was trying to reach Margaret Beach, who'd listed this address on her housing application. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said no one by that name had ever lived there. He'd owned the house for 22 years. I apologized and left. In the car, I pulled up Margaret Beach's clear tenant report on my phone. The report was there. Clean criminal history, no evictions. Credit score 691. But I noticed something I hadn't noticed before, maybe because I'd never had a reason to look that closely. The report had a unique transaction ID, the way all clear tenant reports do. A 16-character string that gets generated when you run the check. I logged into the clear tenant portal directly, bypassing Housing Link, and searched for that transaction ID. No results found. I searched for Rosa Molina's transaction ID. No results found. Dennis Vong's. No results found. The reports were in my files. The transaction IDs were printed on them. But Clear Tenant had no record of those checks ever being run. I sat in the car on Oleander Street, and I felt something shift inside my chest. Not fear exactly, something worse. The feeling you get when you realize the floor you've been standing on is painted onto a drop. The documents were in the system. My name was on them. But the people didn't exist. The background checks had never been run. And I could not account for how any of it had gotten there. That evening I did something I probably should have done immediately. I went through every single one of my 53 units. I pulled every lease, every application, every Clear Tenant report. I cross-referenced every tenant's name against the Clear Tenant portal using their transaction IDs. It took me 4 hours. When I was finished, I had a list. 11 of my 53 tenants did not exist. Their leases were in HousingLink. Their applications were complete. Their background reports were attached. My digital signature was on every one of them. But Clear Tenant had no record of their checks. The phone numbers on their applications either didn't work or connected to people who'd never heard of them. And when I checked their units' status histories in the back end of HousingLink, something Diane had shown me how to do during training for auditing purposes. Every one of those 11 units had quietly reverted to green at some point after I'd set them to red. The status changes had no author tag. In a normal reversion, the system would log which user made the change. These had none. The system treated it as though the units had simply always been vacant. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and a legal pad, and I wrote down the 11 names. Rosa Molina, Dennis Vong, Margaret Beach, Arthur Padilla, Cherie Lasco, Joseph Fenn, Yolanda Bright, Thomas Kurz, Patricia Holm, David Sang, Nina Colazzo. I stared at the names for a long time. I read them out loud. They sounded like real names. They had the weight and texture of real names. But they belonged to no one. The next morning, I went to Diane's office before she'd even taken off her coat. I told her everything. I showed her the list. I showed her the Clear Tenant discrepancies. I showed her the status reversions with no author tags. She sat very still for a while, and then she picked up her phone and called someone named Gerald, who I assumed was in IT or upper management. She spoke quietly, turned away from me for about 3 minutes. Then she hung up and told me to take the rest of the day off. She said they'd look into it. She said it was probably a database corruption issue. She said I shouldn't worry. I went home. I sat at my kitchen table. I stared at the list. And then I did something I hadn't done since Laura's funeral. I called my brother, Kevin. Not because Kevin would understand what was happening. He managed a sporting goods store in Delaware. But because I needed to hear someone's voice who I knew was real. We talked for 20 minutes. He asked how I was holding up. I said fine. He didn't believe me, but he didn't push. When I hung up, I felt a little better. Then I opened my laptop and checked my email. There was a message from Diane sent 12 minutes earlier. It read, "Hi, Marcus. Following up on our conversation, I reviewed the files you flagged. I'm not finding the discrepancies you mentioned. All 11 units show red/occupied with valid tenant records and matching Clear Tenant confirmations. Can you double-check on your end? It's possible your local cache was displaying outdated info. Let me know. That's, D." I logged into HousingLink. I checked Rosa Molina's unit. Red, occupied. I pulled her Clear Tenant report and searched the transaction ID in the portal. It came back valid. I checked Dennis Vong. Same. Margaret Beach. Same. All 11. Every single one now showed as a legitimate, confirmed occupied placement with a valid background check on file. I went back through the unit status histories. The unexplained reversions to green were gone. Each unit showed a clean, unbroken chain. Green to yellow to red, with my name as the processing coordinator at every step, with timestamps matching exactly what I remembered. I want to describe how this felt, because I think it's important to understanding what I did next. It did not feel like relief. It felt like being corrected. Like the system had looked at what I'd found, considered it, and decided it wasn't true. And the worst part was that I couldn't prove otherwise. I hadn't taken screenshots. I hadn't exported the data. I'd written the names on a legal pad, and the names were still there in front of me. But the names were also in the system now, attached to what appeared to be real valid tenants. The only evidence that anything had ever been wrong was my memory, and I knew with the particular clarity of a man whose wife had died 4 months earlier, that my memory was not something anyone would trust. I replied to Diane's email. I told her she was right. It must have been a cash issue, and I apologized for the alarm. She wrote back and said, "No problem. These things happen. Get some rest." I did not get rest. I went to 4412 Delancey Street. I buzzed the panel for 7B. No answer. I waited outside the building for 30 minutes until someone came out, then caught the door and went up to the 7th floor. I knocked on 7B. No answer. I tried the knob. Locked this time. I pressed my ear to the door. Nothing. I knelt down and looked at the gap under the door. There was light inside. The faint flat light of an overhead fixture. Someone had turned on a light. I knocked again. I said my name. I said I was from Colville and Burke and just checking on the unit. Silence. But the light was on. And after a minute standing in that hallway that smelled like carpet adhesive and old cigarettes, I heard something from inside the apartment. Not a voice, not a footstep. A sound like a page turning. A single dry, papery sound. Then another. Then nothing. I left the building and sat in my car. I was shaken, though I couldn't have told you exactly why. Nothing overtly threatening had happened. A light was on. I'd heard a sound. But the fear I felt wasn't about what was in that apartment. It was about the system. It was about the fact that I had found something wrong, proven it wrong, documented it as wrong. And the system had simply rewritten itself to say I was mistaken. And now I was sitting in a parking lot trying to decide whether I was the kind of person who accepted that. Over the next week, I developed a new protocol. Every night after work, I exported my full unit roster to a PDF and emailed it to my personal account. I took screenshots of every unit status page. I downloaded every clear tenant report. I backed everything up to a USB drive that I kept in my glove compartment. If the system changed again, I'd have a record. On June 4th, I processed a new placement. A man named Carl Jessup, 56, applying for a unit at 770 Brabant Drive, Unit 11. His paperwork was clean. His clear tenant report was valid. I checked the transaction ID in the portal immediately, and it was there. I processed the lease, confirmed move-in by phone on June 6th, and set the unit to red. Carl Jessup had a gravelly voice on the phone. He thanked me for the help. He sounded real. He sounded like a person. On June 11th, his unit was green. I had the screenshots. I had the PDF from June 6 showing Unit 11 at 770 Brabant as red, occupied tenant Carl Jessup. I had the clear tenant report saved to my USB drive. I opened the current system and checked. Green, vacant. Carl Jessup's lease was still in the system, but the status was green and the clear tenant transaction ID returned no results in the portal. I checked my backup PDF. There it was, red occupied, Carl Jessup. I checked the other 11, all red, all valid, all confirmed. Whatever had happened to Carl Jessup hadn't happened to them. Or more precisely, it had already happened to them and been undone. And now it was happening to a 12th. I felt like I was watching a system digest. I drove to 770 Brayburn. Unit 11 was on the second floor of a bland 3-story building with a brown brick facade and an uneven concrete parking lot. The building manager was a woman named Sandra, who worked out of a first-floor office that doubled as a storage closet. I asked about Unit 11. She said it was vacant. I asked about Carl Jessup. She said she didn't know anyone by that name. I asked who had most recently occupied the unit. She checked her records. A physical binder, not a digital system. And told me the last tenant in Unit 11 had moved out in October of the previous year. A man named Raymond something. She couldn't quite read the handwriting. I asked if I could see the unit. She gave me a look. Tired, not suspicious, the look of someone who dealt with property management people all day, and handed me a key. I went upstairs. I unlocked the door to Unit 11. The unit was furnished. Not lavishly. A couch. A small kitchen table with 2 chairs. A lamp on the floor, plugged in but off. In the kitchen, there were dishes in the drying rack. Clean dishes. 3 plates, 2 glasses, a fork. In the bathroom, there was a towel hanging on the rack, dry but recently used. It had that slightly stiff quality towels get when they air dry. In the bedroom, the bed was made. Not neatly, but made. The sheets were plain white. There was no closet door, just an opening, and inside the closet there were 4 shirts on hangers. Men's shirts, large. They looked new. The tags had been removed, but the fold creases were still visible. I stood in the bedroom and I could feel my heart in my throat. The building manager had told me this unit was vacant. Had been vacant since October. But someone had been living here. Someone had eaten off these plates, dried themselves with this towel, slept in this bed, hung these shirts in this closet. And that someone, as far as any record or person I could locate was concerned, did not exist. I took photos. I took photos of everything. The dishes, the towel, the bed, the shirts, the lamp. I opened the kitchen drawers, mostly empty. One had a few pieces of mail. I picked them up with the edge of my sleeve, already thinking about this like evidence, though evidence of what I didn't know. There were 3 envelopes, all addressed to Carl Jessup. All at this address, 770 Braben Drive, Unit 11. 2 were from utility companies. One was from the Social Security Administration. Carl Jessup had mail. Carl Jessup had dishes and shirts and a bed. Carl Jessup had a clear tenant report that I had downloaded to a USB drive. But Carl Jessup did not exist in any system I could access. The building manager had never heard of him, and his unit was officially, as far as the world was concerned, empty. I took the mail. I know that's a federal offense. I didn't care. I put it in my jacket pocket and I locked the unit and I returned the key to Sandra. And I drove back to the office with my hands trembling on the steering wheel. That afternoon, I opened the Social Security envelope. Inside was a standard benefit statement. It listed Carl Jessup's name, his date of birth, his projected monthly benefit. It looked completely authentic. I've processed hundreds of Social Security documents in this job. I know what they look like, I know the paperweight, I know the formatting. This was real. But when I searched Carl Jessup's Social Security number through our federal verification tool, the number came back as unused, unissued, a 9-digit number that the Social Security Administration had never assigned to anyone. I went home that night and I sat at my kitchen table and I looked at the legal pad with the 12 names. And I understood something that I want to convey as clearly as I can. These were not people who had existed and then been erased. These were not ghosts. These were not stolen identities. These were fabrications. Complete, detailed, layered fabrications that had been inserted into my caseload, into the housing system, into the physical apartments, with enough substance to pass every check I was trained to perform. Someone or something was creating tenants, manufacturing them, building them from paperwork outward. Lease first, then background check, then move-in confirmation, then mail, then dishes, then shirts on hangers. As if constructing a person in reverse, starting with the bureaucratic shell and slowly filling it inward towards something that might eventually pass for real. The next morning, I did not go to work. I drove to 4412 Delancey instead, back to Rosa Molina's unit. I brought a flashlight and a flathead screwdriver. I don't know what I planned to do if the door was locked. Break in, probably. But it wasn't locked. The knob turned and the door opened, and inside the apartment was fully furnished, lived in, warm. There were shoes by the door. Women's shoes size 7 or 8, a pair of sneakers and a pair of flats. There was a jacket on a hook. There was a half-full coffee mug on the kitchen counter. The coffee was cold but not old. Maybe that morning's, maybe the night before's. I walked through the apartment very slowly. In the living room there was a couch with a blanket folded on one end. A television that was off but warm to the touch when I put my hand near it. A small bookshelf with a dozen paperbacks, all in Spanish. In the bedroom, the bed was unmade. There was a phone charger plugged into the wall, the cord coiled on the nightstand, no phone attached to it. In the bathroom, I found a toothbrush, a tube of toothpaste squeezed from the middle, a prescription bottle of sertraline, 50 milligrams, prescribed to Rosa Molina, filled at a CVS on Greer Avenue on April 10th. I held the bottle in my hand and I read the label 3 times. Rosa Molina. A woman who did not exist had a prescription for antidepressants filled at a real pharmacy. 6 days after I'd processed a lease. I called the CVS. I asked about the prescription. The pharmacist told me she couldn't share patient information. I said I understood. I asked if she could at least confirm that someone named Rosa Molina was a customer. She paused. Then she said she'd check. Then she came back and said she didn't have anyone by that name in the system. I put the bottle back on the sink exactly where I'd found it. I left the apartment. I went to my car, and I called Diane and told her I wouldn't be coming in. She asked if everything was okay. I said I had a stomach thing. She said, feel better. I want to skip ahead now, not because nothing happened in the intervening days, but because what happened was mostly me driving from unit to unit, checking the apartments of all 12 names on my list. Every single one was furnished. Every single one showed signs of habitation. Dishes, toiletries, clothing, mail. In Arthur Padilla's unit, I found a half-eaten sleeve of crackers on the counter and an open library book face down on the couch, as if someone had just stepped out. In Patricia Holmes' unit, there were family photos on a shelf. A woman, a man, 2 children, standing in front of a house I didn't recognize. The woman in the photo looked about 45. She was smiling. She was not anyone I'd ever seen before. I took the photo. I scanned it at a FedEx store and ran it through a reverse image search. Nothing. The image did not exist anywhere online. Someone had printed a family photograph of people who, as far as I could determine, were not real. By this point, I was not sleeping. I was eating poorly. I was aware that I was exhibiting behavior that could be interpreted as a grief-induced breakdown, and I want to acknowledge that possibility honestly, because I considered it myself many times sitting in those empty but not empty apartments. Maybe none of this was real. Maybe I was constructing an elaborate delusional framework because my wife was dead and I couldn't process it. Maybe the apartments were empty and I was hallucinating the dishes and the shoes and the prescription bottles. But I had the photos, I had the mail, I had the USB drive, and I had the backed-up PDF showing units shifting from red to green and back again. I had the prescription bottle I'd photographed with the CVS label clearly visible. Either all of that was fabricated by my own deteriorating mind, or something was actually happening. I chose to believe something was actually happening, because the alternative was worse. On June 19th, I went back to Carl Jessup's unit at 770 Braben. I had been there 6 days earlier, and it had been furnished, lived in, warm. When I opened the door this time, the apartment was different. The furniture was still there, the bed was still made. But there was something else now. Something that stopped me in the doorway. There was a man sitting at the kitchen table. He was facing away from me, looking at the wall. He was wearing one of the shirts I'd seen in the closet. A dark blue button-down still creased from the packaging. He was sitting very still. Not moving, not eating, not reading, just sitting. His hands were on the table, palms down. I could see the back of his head, brown hair thinning. He was breathing, I think. His shoulders rose and fell very slightly, but he did not react to the door opening. He did not turn around. I stood in the doorway for what felt like a very long time. Then I said his name. I said, Carl? He turned his head, not quickly. Slowly, the way someone turns when they're not sure they heard something. He looked at me. He had a face, a completely normal, unremarkable face. Brown eyes, a slightly crooked nose. He looked like a man in his mid-50s who hadn't slept well. He looked at me and he said, yes? His voice was the same gravelly voice I'd heard on the phone when I confirmed his move-in. I asked him how he was settling in. I don't know why I said that. It was the most banal thing I could have said. But something in me defaulted to the professional script, the Koval and Burke courtesy call language, as if the most important thing in that moment was to maintain the fiction that this was normal. He said he was settling in fine. He said the unit was nice. He thanked me again for the help. He was looking at me the whole time with an expression that was perfectly pleasant and completely empty, like a photograph of someone being friendly rather than an actual person experiencing friendliness. I asked him where he worked. His application had listed a warehouse on the east side. He said the warehouse. I asked which one. He paused, just for a second, less than a second, and said the name, the same name that was on his application. Then he turned back around and faced the wall again. I left. I drove home. I sat in the driveway for an hour. I thought about what I'd seen. A man sitting in a chair facing a wall. He'd answered my questions correctly. He'd used the right name, the right employer, the right voice. But he'd been sitting alone in an apartment staring at a wall, and when I'd left it, he'd turned back to the wall. And I knew with a certainty I cannot fully articulate, that he would still be sitting there now and tomorrow and the next day. Not living, not doing anything a person does. Just occupying the unit, just filling the space his paperwork said he should fill. I checked Housing Link that night. Carl Jessup's unit was red, occupied. Clear tenant confirmation valid. Everything in order. Over the next 3 days, I visited 4 more units. I found people in 2 of them. Yolanda Bright was standing in her kitchen, not cooking, not cleaning, just standing with her hands at her sides, looking at the refrigerator. She turned when I came in and greeted me by my name. "Hello, Marcus," even though I'd never met her in person. She answered my questions with the same precise, correct, slightly delayed responses Carl Jessup had given. Then she turned back to the refrigerator. Thomas Kurtz was lying on his couch, fully dressed, shoes on, staring at the ceiling. He sat up when I entered and smiled at me. He had a wide, generous smile. He thanked me for placing him in the unit. He said he was comfortable. He said everything was fine. I asked him what he'd been doing that day. He said resting. I asked him what he'd done the day before. He paused. Then he said resting. I asked him what he'd done the day before that. He said resting. His smile never changed. The other 2 units were unoccupied but furnished. The tenants, Joseph Fenn and Nina Colazzo, were not present. But their things were there. Their dishes were in the racks. Their beds were made. Their closets held clothes. They were, I thought, not yet finished. They were still being built. The paperwork was done. The apartment was staged. The physical person just hadn't arrived yet. I drove to the office on June 23rd, and I walked into Diane's office, and I closed the door, and I told her everything. Not the abbreviated version I'd given her before. Everything. The names, the apartments, the prescription bottle, the man sitting at the table facing the wall, the woman staring at the refrigerator. I spoke for 20 minutes straight, and Diane listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Marcus, how many active units are you managing right now?" I said 53. She shook her head. She turned her monitor toward me. She pulled up my coordinated dashboard. The number at the top of the screen read 61. I had 61 active units. I counted them. 53 that I recognized and 8 new ones I had never seen before. 8 units I had not processed, had not reviewed applications for, had not confirmed move-ins on. But there they were, red, occupied, with my digital signature on every lease. I looked at the tenant names on those 8 new units. I didn't recognize any of them, but I recognized the pattern. Complete applications. Clean, clear tenant reports. Everything in order. Everything perfect. 8 new people who did not exist, placed into 8 new apartments that they would slowly begin to fill with dishes and towels and shirts on hangers, and the quiet, vacant performance of being alive. I looked at Diane. She was watching me with an expression I couldn't read. Then she said something that ended the conversation, and in a meaningful way ended my time at Colville and Burke Property Management. She said, "The number was 58 yesterday." She said it calmly. She said it the way she said everything, as if the world was composed of boring policies with boring explanations. But her hands were flat on her desk, and her knuckles were white. "It was 53 when you started," she said. "It's 61 now. And I've checked the other coordinators." She paused. "It's not just you." I asked her what she meant. She said that across the firm's entire portfolio, approximately 14% of active tenants could not be independently verified. She said the number had been growing. She said she'd noticed it 3 years ago, when it was closer to 4%, and she'd reported it, and nothing had happened, and she'd watched it climb. She said she didn't know what they were. She didn't use the word they. She said the placements. She talked about them the way you talk about a weather pattern. Something observable, something measurable, something you couldn't stop. I asked her why she hadn't told me. She said she'd been told not to, by Gerald, by the people above Gerald. She said the firm's position was that the placements were a data anomaly and that drawing attention to them created liability. She said she'd been told explicitly that raising the issue with new coordinators was grounds for termination. I asked her what happened to the placements over time. She said they stabilized. The units stayed red. The tenants, or whatever they were, remained in the apartments. They received mail. They occasionally appeared in person. They did not cause problems. They did not interact with neighbors in any notable way. They simply existed on paper and increasingly in physical space as tenants. She said that as far as the buildings were concerned, the units were occupied. Rent was paid. She didn't know by whom or how, but the payments appeared in the system, and the landlords never complained. I asked her if she'd ever visited one of them. She said once, 3 years ago. A unit on the west side. A woman sitting on a bed looking at the wall. Diane had said hello. The woman had turned and smiled and said everything was fine. Diane had left and never gone back. I asked her what they were. She said she didn't know. She said it again. She didn't know. She said she'd stop trying to know. She said the number was going to keep climbing, and there was nothing she or I or anyone at Colville and Burke could do about it, because the system processed them the same way it processed real tenants, and the landlords accepted them the same way they accepted real tenants, and the buildings absorbed them the same way they absorbed real tenants. She said the city had a housing occupancy rate that was tracked by municipal agencies, and that rate had been climbing for 2 years, and she believed it, though she couldn't prove it, that some portion of that increase consisted of units occupied by people who did not exist. I quit on June 25th. I didn't give 2 weeks' notice. I sent an email to Diane and HR, and I walked out with my USB drive in my pocket. That was 10 months ago. I'm going to tell you what I've done since then, and then I'm going to tell you the part that made me decide to write this down. I moved. I sold the house Laura and I had shared. The bank was going to take it anyway, and I rented a small apartment on the south side and near my brother's place in Delaware. I got a job at a hardware store. I stopped thinking about Colville and Burke for periods of time that gradually got longer. 3 days, then a week, then 2 weeks without checking Housing Link, which I could no longer access anyway. But I kept the USB drive and I kept the legal pad with the names. And sometimes at night I'd take them out and look at them, the way you look at evidence of something that happened in a dream. Half convinced it was real, half convinced you'd imagined it. 3 weeks ago I was at the hardware store. It was a Tuesday afternoon, quiet. A man came in and asked for a specific type of wood screw. A number 8 by 1 1/4 inch flathead, brass. I showed him to the aisle. He thanked me. He had a gravelly voice. I looked at his face, brown eyes, slightly crooked nose. He looked like a man in his mid-50s who hadn't slept well. He smiled at me, a wide, generous smile, and he said, "Hello, Marcus." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. He picked up a box of screws, read the label carefully, and took them to the register. My coworker rang him up. He paid in cash. He walked out. I watched him through the front window as he crossed the parking lot. He got into a car, a gray sedan, ordinary, unremarkable, and drove away. He did not look back. That night I searched the address of my own apartment in every public records database I could access. The lease was in my name. The utilities were in my name. Everything was normal. But I searched the building's occupancy records through the city assessor's website, and I found that my building has 24 units. I've walked every hallway. I've counted every door. There are 22. I don't know which 2 units exist only in the records. I don't know who is listed as living in them. I don't know if the number was 24 when I moved in, or if it became 24 after. I don't know if it will be 25 next month. I know that somewhere in a database in a system I can't access, there is a complete file for a person who isn't real, with a valid lease and a clean background check and a confirmed move-in date, and that person is listed as my neighbor. And I know that eventually, if the patent holds, there will be dishes in a drying rack and shirts on hangers, and a prescription bottle with a name on it, and then one day there will be someone sitting in a chair, facing a wall, breathing very softly, waiting to be checked on. I also know something else, and this is the part that made me write this down. Last week I was going through a box of old papers. Laura's things mostly, stuff I hadn't had the strength to sort, and I found a piece of mail I didn't recognize. It was addressed to me at our old house on Meeker Street, postmarked October of last year. I'd never opened it. It must have arrived after I'd stopped collecting the mail and before the house sold. The return address was the Social Security Administration. I opened it. Inside was a benefit statement, my name, my date of birth, my projected monthly benefit. Everything correct except one thing. The Social Security number on the statement was not mine. I've checked. My real Social Security number is the same one it's always been. I verified it against my tax returns, my driver's license, everything. The number on the statement is different. It's a number that, when I search it, comes back as unissued, unassigned. A 9-digit number the Social Security Administration has never given to anyone. But it's on a piece of mail with my name on it, in a format I recognize as authentic, sent to my address. and I've been sitting with it for a week now, turning it over, trying to understand what it means. And the only conclusion I keep arriving at is one I can't accept and can't refute. Somewhere in a system I can't see, there is a file for a man named Marcus Lender. His application is complete. His background check is clean. His lease is signed. His move-in is confirmed. His unit is red. And I don't think it's me.
Disappearing into an industrial area where they probably had a warehouse or someplace to strip stolen goods.